By 1992, UN sanctions had left Gaddafi isolated and Libya branded a global pariah.
We're talking of an ideological dictatorship of which the vast majority of the wealth of the country was siphoned away into the pockets of the Gaddafi regime, his sons, his hangers-on, and of course, if you spoke out against that, you might get killed.
Years of sponsoring militant groups and suppressing all opposition had led to a climate of global menace.
During the Cold War, he had managed to align himself with the Soviet bloc.
And that was all stopped when the Berlin Wall came down.
He had no friends left in the Arab world, was involved in conspiracies to assassinate 3 Arab monarchs.
Gaddafi spoke of reforms abroad. At home, prisons overflowed with journalists, students, and opposition figures. Whispers of torture echoed within their cells.
We're speaking about a society in the 1990s which is North Korea-esque in terms of how closed off it is from the world and how afraid people are to speak out.
Libya's story didn't begin in repression, but under King Idris, guided by British oversight in its infancy. In 1952, amid regional upheaval, Libyans cast their first free votes, kindling a fragile spark of democratic hope.
Syria and startling news of turmoil. A military revolt deposes its president, General Adib Shishekli. Middle East unrest continues less than 400 miles away in Egypt, site of the troublesome Suez Canal, where another military strongman is ousted. Succeeding Egypt's first president is Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser with mustache, who was always at Naguib's side.
From 1967 onwards, the world is going the way of Nasser and the Algerians, who are incredibly pro-Palestinian and allowing Palestinian terrorists to train and be based there and things of this nature. So Libyans felt the kingdom is backward-looking and is not keeping up with the politics of the present.
Cheering throngs waited to acclaim Nasser, the man who might yet set the entire Middle East, perhaps the world, aflame.
There was a different attitude between Brits and Americans, whereby the Brits wanted to keep the king in power, but the Americans were already allowing for the idea that, oh, if a moderate Arab nationalist comes into power, we should support him so that we don't end up with a completely pro-Soviet radical regime in Libya. There were many potential coup attempts or people who wanted to overthrow the regime in that period. There's a joke that there were something like 7 coups planned for August and September in 1969.
As unrest in Libya intensified, several coups against the monarchy were simmering beneath the surface. For one British teacher, what began as an ordinary posting was about to brush dangerously close to a plot that could alter the course of history.
I was there in Libya in 1968 to 1970. It revolved really around my landlord, Ben Narji. He was early 40s, late 30s. He was very good English. He'd been number 3 in the army, which I didn't know when I met him. He had the reputation for being close to coups because he was in Iraq and a coup happened, the 1958 one, and he was in Egypt and a coup happened there in 1952, and the joke was that wherever he is, there will be a coup. The relationship very, very quickly became more than a landlord-tenant. It was very clear he wasn't happy with what was happening in Libya. He called the king that stupid old man. The opinion was that the poor, who we often saw on the side of the road, he used to say, look at that man there. He's got nothing. He's sleeping in the open air. He's got nothing. Where's he getting his food from? And he was very alert to the state of some of the 1.6 or 2 million Libyans. And so around him, there was a wider group, and Shukri Ghanem, who later became Prime Minister in 2003, was one of them. He was in oil, and it was he who got me my job working for the Daily News and writing the newspaper articles. But Ben and Shukri frequently came round together, and they wanted me to talk politics. It was a three-sided political discussion in which coups and revolutions did come up. The next thing that really occurred to me was Ben asked if I'd go to Jerba to give him cover. And I said, what for? And he said, I'm not at liberty to say. And he went missing for half one of the days. And in the evening, he said, I have been meeting Colonel Sardadine Abu Shwarib. It dawned on me then that this was getting really serious, that an active colonel was being involved.
A change in Libya's government was seeming inevitable. King Idris had really lost interest in governing, was spending more time back on his farm or overseas having medical treatment. His health was failing. And everybody was waiting for something to happen. Everybody knew there had to be a change. The situation was unsustainable.
So the idea was the Crown Prince would inherit on September the 2nd after the king abdicated, and then, without deposing the king, they would just replace the Crown Prince, who was widely thought to be not up to much.
Elsewhere, plans moved in shadow. A different faction. A different vision.
Many armies throughout the Middle East, seen as collaborating with the West, had dissident groups of army officers who formed secret societies trying to overthrow that government. Gaddafi joined with a series of army officers which were termed the Revolutionary Command Council. And this is just as Naguib and Nasser in Egypt had overthrown King Farouk by having some army officers in a Revolutionary Command Council. Although Gaddafi was the leading light, he was the firebrand behind these group of officers, he didn't necessarily want to initially put himself forward as the key actor.
When I returned from London, somebody came up and said, there's a big car waiting for you. The driver said, I have been sent by the Minister of State for Prime Minister's Affairs. And his exact words were, on September 5th, it will happen. And I said, the revolution? And he nodded. When you hear this music, you will know it is us that have carried it out. While all this was going on, while we were leading up to this revolution, I was approached on the 30th of May, 1968, by the SIS head for Tripoli. He'd heard about me, and would I be a window on what he'd heard I'd got involved in? He said, his words were, if there is going to be a revolution, I want it to be a pro-Western one and a pro-British one. Could you just be a window? I'm not interfering in any way. You just carry on and do what you would normally do, but just keep me informed. And on that basis, I said, okay. He actually joked and he said, I'm Kitchener, saying in the First World War, your country needs you.
There is a theory that September 1st, 1969 was the day selected for the coup attempt because they discovered, the Revolutionary Command Council, that there were other coup attempts and that if they didn't get there first, it would be too late.
The 1st of September, I was only thinking one thing. The first day of the new semester at the university, I need to be there on time. after about a mile or two, it just dawned on me, where's the traffic? There's no traffic. And I got there, and the gates were closed. And then I saw a soldier from Fezzan. This was an untypical soldier. So he had a gun and fired into the air, and I could hear the live round. He looked at me, and I looked back at him, and I went. When I'd driven a couple of miles, I saw this convoy of military vehicles ahead coming towards me. And I zigzagged and got back home. And then somebody said to me at the gate, there's been a coup, you know, there's been a coup. It seems to be the police are resisting, and it seems to be army. And there's a curfew. If you break the curfew, you get shot. I went in and I put the radio on. About 11 o'clock, the music played. And I thought, goodness, it's happened.
Then came the sinking realization this wasn't their coup anymore. Gaddafi had slipped inside their plan and twisted it. He wasn't looking west. He was looking to Cairo, to Nasser, to revolution without compromise, to a model where one man could speak for a nation and silence all others. And as their version collapsed, Gaddafi's revolution roared to life.
I went to Castle Square. I was the only Westerner. There was a lorry that came by with a gallows stuck out at the back. There were about 30 young men, all with their arms up and waving and so on. And there was a dummy, a life-size dummy hanging with a noose round its neck. And so I thought, well, this definitely isn't bad. So that was a real review that something had gone wrong. But we didn't know who had had the revolution. They'd masqueraded. This is the cleverness of Gaddafi. He knew the plan. He knew about the music. He'd infiltrated what we were doing. He knew what Bashir had said to me. And the Americans had heard the music, and therefore the Americans accepted the revolution as being okay for a week, and that week is what they needed to get entrenched.
So when Gaddafi takes over on the 1st of September of 1969, he calls this the El Fateh Revolution, the victory or opening revolution.
And Gaddafi himself, the revolution initially was very popular with Libyans.
So you need to think of a man, Muammar Gaddafi, who comes from an illiterate Bedouin family, but his parents understood that he had unbelievable aptitude, and he was seen as having incredible promise. So he was sent away to study for something that was akin to high school, and he had to commute to it or live apart from his family.
I don't know how much of this is fact, but he's rumoured to have been bullied at school as a sort of simple peasant. And that may have played into his dictatorial behaviour later on in life, I don't know.
And then as a way that he could make money, it was seen, oh, he should join the army. He rose up to being the rank of colonel. And he also had a lot of interactions with Egyptian school teachers in the late 1950s and 1960s. And those Egyptian school teachers were bringing Nasserism. Nasser was as famous an orator to the Arabic-speaking peoples as, say, Hitler was to the Germanic-speaking peoples. He was a once-in-history phenomenon in terms of how he had spellbinding radio addresses, and he preached against the exploitation of colonialism, particularly British colonialism. So you can imagine a situation where if you were not from one of the elite families or from those Eastern tribes that were benefiting from the monarchy, you would have felt that this was an unjust order that needed to be changed.
There was a big build-up, and then Gaddafi strode down, and the square was packed with Arabs, and they were all applauding and cheering. But when he spoke, it was very hesitant. It was almondeur and long silences in Arabic, and I was about the only Westerner there, I think. But what he was saying was that he was going to get rid of the American base at Wheelus.
Transformation for Libyans was initially a positive, but of course for outside powers, the British and Americans, it was a threat, because given his anti-colonialist and nationalist rhetoric, was very keen to see the foreign presence removed. And there were very important strategic American and British bases in Libya, which he did demand were removed.
Colonel Daniel James, decorated Tuskegee Airman, Korean war ace, and the first black American to command a US airbase. He'd stared down enemies at 30,000 feet, but in Libya, a different kind of confrontation was brewing.
Colonel James, who I met that evening, told me personally what had happened that morning. Gaddafi showed up, he led the column, and personally he spoke to Colonel James and said, I'm taking over the base. So leave. And this is what he had said in Castle Square 2 days earlier, and now he was actually doing it. And he had his hand on his holster the whole time and rapped out, if you move your finger, I shall shoot you. And there was this confrontation where both of them, as in an old film, you know, two men with their hands on their guns. And Colonel James won and Gaddafi backed off. So when I met Colonel James that evening, he wore a great chain round his neck with a crown on it. And he said, well, I'm a fan of the king. He didn't say why. None of this came out until later, that he had seen Gaddafi off personally. And he was now saying, oh, actually, bring the king back.
The king may have governed from afar, but Gaddafi ruled with anger. Within his first year, the noose had tightened. Political parties banned, the media seized and censored, alcohol outlawed, foreign languages erased from every sign, the Americans and the British gone, the Italians expelled, their homes taken, books burned and forgotten. This was no longer a revolution. This was a purge, a cultural cleansing.
Muammar Gaddafi understood that just as the Senussi monarchs had allowed a separate center of power in the army that then ended up overthrowing them, he mustn't allow there to be any other separate centers of power. He cracked down on any kind of civil society, he cracked down on political parties, and he understood to eviscerate the army. He wanted everything to revolve around him and his ideology so that the army couldn't be a separate power center and potentially overthrow him. Therefore, he made different security arrangements, using loyalists from his tribe or from his region in informal structures.
After the 1969 coup, Gaddafi unveiled the Revolutionary Command Council, a tight circle of young officers cast as guardians of the revolution. They were the face of change, the promise of a new Libya. But behind the titles, behind the uniforms, there was only one voice that mattered. They didn't lead, they obeyed. And if you were called to stand before them, you weren't there to be heard. You were there to be judged, and judgment in Gaddafi's Libya was rarely survived.
My visit to the Revolutionary Command Council Centre quite early on in the revolution was through the daily news. We were driven to the Libyan radio station, and it was chaos, and there were armoured vehicles and there were guns, and he said outside the door, "This is the censor." So I sat there with the censor, and he had all my articles in a pile on the table in front of him. And he said, "You wrote all these." They were all centre pages taken out. I said, yes, I did. He said, "You were in breach of your contract. You have broken the law by working for the Daily News, and that is wrong. In addition, you have written against the revolution and for the king." And I said, no. If you look at my article, The Old British Consulate and the Baker, you'll see that I'm criticising the way the bakers have to work. And he looked and he said, yes, you're right. So then he said, "You must never write any more articles, and I will be watching you. We will be watching you." I was free to go, so I went back expecting to be shot on the way out.
What Libyans heard now came from one voice: Gaddafi. Revolutionary courts crushed dissent. Committees turned citizens into informants. Privacy vanished, replaced by paranoia.
He held on to power because he built a very repressive state apparatus, which in a very small society like Libya, where the population is tiny and everybody knows everybody else, if you have an apparatus where anything you say to somebody might be reported back, then you live constantly in fear and you're very careful.
So immediately there was a fawn Volkswagen outside. Outside the gate there was always one with a couple of people there, and wherever I went they followed. And if I went to the bank, they came and stood on either side of me and had a look to see what I was doing. And this was his way of making sure that a journalist he was suspicious of was just kept under control. Form of isolating me. One wasn't free at all. For a start, we were told you cannot leave Libya, and we were therefore prisoners. No exit visa would be granted for any foreign lecturer who was there. Little by little, a curfew was lifted, but one had to be very careful. When I went back to university for the first lecture, I was told that it was all different, and I was now going to be having a class of 130 that particular day, and that they would all be in uniform and armed, with guns laid out in the aisle, rifles and so on. And I had to teach a short story by Hemingway, and I chose one to do with gentleness. Kind of indirect question without asking it. The first time Gaddafi came to the university was towards the end of October. I was sitting in the front row with a student who was translating, and he stared at me for about 20 seconds, and he said, "Some journalists will be executed." I was being marked, but the second time he came was on the 1st of January. All the students in about 6 or 7 classes had to line up and greet him, and his jeep arrived, and Gaddafi got out, and my students, it would have to be my class, completely let me down and rushed forward and threw their arms round his neck and kissed him, mwah, mwah, and so on, female and male together. And he was mobbed by about 12 of my students, and he had his hands by his side like a tailor's dummy. Weirdly, I had his head on my shoulder for several seconds with the hat above it. And I looked at him and his eyes were closed like that. Just didn't like being touched or kissed, or he didn't like this sort of mob adulation. And his hat was just in the way, so I did that with my shoulder. His hat rolled into the dust and I got away with it.
As the revolutionary government consolidated its power at the end of the 60s, early 70s, undoubtedly they became very repressive and clamped down on any form of dissent or criticism, and tended to single out people for punishment to try and deter others. Would have felt like a police state, certainly very oppressive.
The knock could come at any hour. No explanation, no warning, just a quiet summons. Questions came quickly, so did threats. These weren't arrests. They were warnings. Proof that they were watching, and that if they chose, you could vanish. It happened to more people than you'd think. One of them was Haga, and across the table, someone held his life like a fragile thread, ready to cut it without hesitation.
He was the advisor to Jaloud, who was Gaddafi's number 2, and over the phone he was talking in Arabic. Jaloud had obviously said, "You must ring the ambassador. You can execute him, but you must ring the ambassador." So he tried to ring Donald Maitland, but Maitland was asleep, so the phone rang and rang and rang. At 5 o'clock he said, "Right, you can go, you can all go, but you," he said of me, "have got to come back here this evening because I haven't finished with you." He was waiting for me at the front door when I appeared. So I went in and there were 3 others there, and he plonked a bottle of whiskey in front of me and some water, and he said, "Help yourself to a drink." And I thought, well, this is a trap, and I didn't want to not do it, but I thought I'd have a tiny bit. So I had a token amount and a lot of water, and he went berserk and said, "You're having your drink small. You're in league with others. You're a spy. You're this. You're that. We're not having it." And then they started belabouring me, and I was sort of going like this, and they're all hitting and punching, and he came back with this dagger, and he was raising it as though he was going to plunge it down into me. So I got up, kicked the chair over, headed for the front door, got out, thank goodness for Volkswagen, started first time, and as the car drew off, he was saying, "Next time I meet you, I will kill you." This was 2 days after Gaddafi had said, again, some journalists will be executed, because he repeated that 5 or 6 times during my time in Libya, and I thought I've really got to be careful because I really nearly was a journalist who was executed.
Soon after, Haga escaped to Libya. The message was clear. The country was no longer safe for Westerners. Staying meant dying.
I just saw the hardening of the regime over 9 months. It got harder and harder and harder. And it was nearing the reign of terror phase in a revolution. Revolutions go through phases, and the reign of terror wasn't far off.
For the period 1969 to 1973, we need to think of Libya as being governed in a rather Nasserist way. How can we have a mass popular movement? How can we mobilize the youth? How can we mobilize in universities? How can we mobilize people to participate in the revolution?
Gaddafi developed his bizarre philosophy of the Arab Islamic socialism, the Jamahiriya, which in theory he described as a form of statelessness, that he wasn't going to have the institutions which became corrupt everywhere else, that they were going back to an ideal pre-bureaucratic society based on family and tribal links.
In 1973, as whispers of a coup echoed within the Revolutionary Command Council, Gaddafi stood at a crossroad. He traveled to Zuwara and delivered a speech that left no doubt, no resignation, no compromise, a ruthless warning to anyone daring to challenge his rule. Gaddafi launched a cultural revolution, and from that moment, his grip only tightened.
He's angry at the Libyan people. The Libyan people have not understood Arab nationalism. They haven't understood how great Gaddafi is and what a great job he and Abdus Salam Jalloud have done. The Libyan people haven't wanted to be at the forefront of the Arab world. So he chastises them and he moves in this more negative direction.
Later on in 1973, I think, there was a hanging. A student, they wanted to know who was against the revolution and hang them. He was the first. And they led him outside into the grounds and they hanged him just near where I used to park my car. This is after I left Libya. And that became the pattern. A number of students were hanged like that. On one occasion, 10,000 in the university had to watch, and all the women were sobbing, and it was watch out because it could be you. It was government by ruthless display of violence, and if you don't do what we say, you'll be the same.
Eventually, they moved to the creation of the committees where people would be involved in debate and discussion and feeding ideas up to the General People's Congress. And the machinery was established which appeared to allow for bottom-up representation of the people and their wishes, leading up to a leadership which would act on that. Although those institutions were created, they worked in the opposite way. The leaders of the revolution and the revolutionary command structure still exercised all power and took all decisions and fed them down through that machinery to the local level. The ideology was that you would involve people in direct democracy, but that's not the way it worked. The revolutionary cadres really controlled everything.
Sorry, you have annoyed me in England. Therefore, you got me no chance to learn English.
The one moment that is frequently cited as entirely definitive in Gaddafi turning to be more extreme in his ideology is 1975. He detects a putsch attempt among different members of the Revolutionary Command Council to oust him. And it's at that point that he entirely cracks down and he purges and he begins the writing of the Green Book to codify a revolutionary third way and to turn Libya into an ideological totalitarian state rather than a more classical Arab nationalist socialist dictatorship.
And it was Gaddafi's version of the little red book that Lin Piao used to wave in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, but it put into practice freedom, unity, and socialism. So he tried to translate the slogan of 3 words into what it meant for Libya, which basically meant no privatization, state running everything, no political parties.
After the coup in 1975, with the writing of the Green Book, he has a different ideology, which is that it is the strongest who leads, but I have to, by the nose, pull the Libyan people along with me. I have to make them pan-Arabist. I have to make them pan-African. I can't just represent these things. You know, he had female bodyguards and he wore a big necklace with the African continent on it, so people didn't take him seriously. He said that he was the king of kings. I take Gaddafi seriously. This Green Book is an ideological manifesto. It has certain ideas about renting, about committees, about the role of the people in sovereignty, of the need to not have mediating institutions. The reason why Gaddafi doesn't believe in political parties or in civil society is those would be mediating institutions which could be alternative focal points of power. The people needs to exist as an entity, and then there is the guide. That's Gaddafi, the brother leader, the guide, who is directing this almost Hegelian process of the people coming to understand itself. He then concludes, but that's all just theory. The strong always rule. There's that line right there in the Green Book signaling to you that, you know, I'm a thinker, but I also understand that dictatorship is about power. We're speaking of a full-blown totalitarianism growing from 1975 onward. And it's critical to look at these periods because Gaddafi was roughly popular in the wake of the coup until 1975, because oil wealth was nationalized, money is flowing in, Libya is asserting its place in the world, it's becoming a more powerful country. But then after he had to purge the Revolutionary Command Council people who were going to overthrow him, he then becomes more dark and more paranoid and is focused on these ideological projects of nationalizations, expropriations, taking over merchants' businesses, taking over landlords' properties, things that are more define a totalitarian regime rather than just a dictatorial one.
As you see it, is violence by a guerrilla group justified?
Of course, we refuse, and all the human beings must refuse the violence. And we must find other means. But if you have no other way to get your right, you are excused to be violent.
As he went on in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of that, of supporting terrorism. He was getting arms from Russia in the mid-70s, and he made 2 visits to Moscow. And so he was very much on the Russian side in the Cold War.
The leaders of the Western world have called you a terrorist, Colonel Gaddafi.
Your government is a terrorist government. Reagan is the biggest terrorist in the world. You are far from the civilization. We are a nation of civilization. I think Britain decided to export terrorism instead of these goods.
We enter into a period in the 1980s of a very totalitarian, very aggressive, very liberationist dictatorship that is spending a significant amount of its wealth funding foreign terrorists.
Do you support that particular kind of activity? Do you feel it is beneficial at all?
I said we are against terrorism and against terrorists, but we support legal struggle for freedom.
This is because he believed in it, that something had happened where he bought into his hype of, I am the one who is going to lead to the liberation of the Third World.
It wasn't a very big demonstration, but some of these anti-Gaddafi students had come from as far as Manchester, their faces hidden to avoid identification by observers inside the bureau.
Gaddafi is a terrorist!
You have killing of dissidents, you have a system whereby Libyan foreign students abroad are spied on, and there's the stray dog policy in the 1980s that Libyan students who become anti-Gaddafi are assassinated abroad as stray dogs. Brits will potentially be aware of the killing of Fletcher.
WPC Fletcher was in the middle of the square as part of the thin cordon to stop the demonstrators getting too close to the bureau. On the other side, underneath the bureau, a small group of pro-Gaddafi students started chanting in opposition, but they stayed well back. And then the shooting.
Whereabouts were you when the explosion happened?
Well, I was with the Prime Minister at the time, and the explosion happened just as we were packing up.
The Prime Minister went to Brighton police station to tell newsmen about her own escape. She was awake and had just completed work on her conference speech when the bomb went off.
My husband was in bed and all the windows went, and the bathroom was extremely badly damaged.
In your own room?
Yes, we were very lucky. You hear about these atrocities, these bombs. You don't expect them to happen to you. But life must go on as usual.
Part of that bomb was from Gaddafi. So you could say that Gaddafi had a role in or a share in the Brighton bomb.
But it's widely documented that the supplies were quite extensive, and not only to the IRA, but to a whole range of other groups, Baader Meinhof, Red Army faction, anybody who claimed to be fighting imperialism at that era.
We support them, but they themselves choose the way how to restore their independence, how to get rid of the colonization of England.
By 1985, the world was closing in. Sanctions loomed. Enemies circled. And for the first time, Gaddafi began to shift. He reached out to Britain, not out of trust, but necessity. It wasn't a change of heart. It was a change of tactics.
We should be delighted to restore relations between the two countries. And that cooperation in the various fields between the two countries should be resumed. There are mutual interests for both countries, which we mustn't give away or give up.
Gaddafi had become Washington's most wanted strongman, a man who bankrolled hijackings, armed radicals, and spilt blood across continents. He drew a line in the sea, the so-called line of death. In March 1986, the US crossed it. Libya fired first, and the United States responded, disabling missile sites and sinking naval vessels. But the story coming out of Libya was different.
Colonel Gaddafi emerged on a balcony outside his military headquarters in Tripoli this evening to lead celebrations into what is being presented here as a military victory. Gaddafi said that Libya had resisted American provocation. We defended ourselves and we drove them out, he declared. And Colonel Gaddafi vowed that the Americans would be repulsed as the British had before them. He accused President Reagan, an actor who wants to rule the world, of lying about US successes during clashes in the Gulf of Sirte. He repeated claims that 3 American aircraft had been destroyed. No Libyan radar had been damaged, and he said an American missile which failed to explode had been handed to the Russians. But for all Colonel Gaddafi's fiery rhetoric tonight, there were no direct threats, no repetition of earlier warnings that suicide squads would be sent to attack American targets.
There was a Berlin discotheque bombing targeting American servicemen stationed in Germany that was successful. People were killed.
The Libyan embassy in East Berlin have been involved in carrying out that attack.
These things, particularly the Berlin disco bombing, led to Ronald Reagan calling Gaddafi the mad dog of the Middle East and launching what was supposed to be a decapitation airstrike on Libya in 1986.
If the Americans were directly trying to wipe out Colonel Gaddafi's home, they couldn't have got much closer. The area is badly damaged by blast, but the house itself was not destroyed, the bombs missing by a whisker. The raid on Colonel Gaddafi's headquarters in Tripoli had blasted his home and family, killing an adopted daughter.
But people were saying he didn't have a daughter, so then the story became adopted daughter. Now, I'm sorry if any 3-year-old was killed, but officially none of it was believed. He was making it up to make people feel bad about it. That's what the official line was.
The US bombs knocked out his favourite Bedouin tent, where he was most likely to be.
He was worried and forever then paranoid. The Americans represented a serious threat to him.
Completely made Gaddafi lose his confidence.
Cars filled the promenade in a crazed procession. He told them, lift the blackout and dance. Idolised, even kissed by the faithful, Gaddafi's reappearance in public has restored confidence. But his message remains defiant. Libya will continue to incite popular revolution everywhere in the world. And an open challenge to the Americans: if you want to come back, Libya is ready to fight.
As far as he was concerned, the fact that he was still alive meant that he had won.
In the months and years that followed, passenger jets fell from the sky. No warning, no mercy. Hundreds were killed. The message unmistakable and cold.
There was the UTA bombing of a French international airliner, and then Lockerbie.
We've just heard that the crashed jumbo jet was carrying a large number of US servicemen apparently returning to the States for Christmas.
At least 275 lives lost.
Do you think that there's a chance of improving Libya's relations with Britain?
No, because Britain is like America, and I don't think Britain is an independent country during Thatcher's regime. We consider Britain is a colony for America.
The 1990s are the black decade in Libya, because after Lockerbie in 1988, you have a movement towards blanket UN sanctions that come into play by 1992, and then Libya is cut off. Living standards drop precipitously. Libyan students can't study abroad. The use of foreign languages in Libya is banned. Foreign goods can't really get into Libya. And the creature comforts of a place that was actually quite wealthy, to then we have a place which is going to pariah status, rogue state status. And that's when life got really, really rough. Families had their sons put in prison, and there's the Bou Salim prison massacre.
Well-known Libyan dissidents or critics of the regime suddenly disappeared.
When a ideological dictatorship is most cut off from the world and its people are suffering the most, it is the securest. Kim Jong-il in North Korea was never in danger of being overthrown. The people are completely poor. They're cut off from the world. They're starving. They can't really see how to overthrow him. So in the 1990s, he wasn't really in danger of being overthrown because Libya was in a position of being very poor, very cut off from the world.
After a decade of defiance, something changed. Cornered by sanctions and isolation, Gaddafi extended an olive branch. He traded bombs for business, terror for diplomacy. But for Gaddafi, it was never about trust, only survival.
The only hope, really, to drag Libya forward economically was to come back into the mainstream and invite foreign businesses in. I imagine he was also scarred by the fate of Saddam Hussein. He was taken aback by the reaction to 9/11. Everything conspired to move him in that direction.
He lost his confidence and had to rebuild himself in a new way.
For many years, Britain and Libya were at each other's throats, with Libya funding the IRA to kill British soldiers and Britain backing the American bombing of Libya. Now they say that's all in the past. But whether this historic meeting really does lead to a new Libya, a new friendship, is up to Colonel Gaddafi.
Once he changed his policies in the early 2000s and started to build relationships with the West, then he was invited to Brussels on an EU visit. There was a big visit to Italy. He went to the UN. These were big steps, and they felt a step on the way to Gaddafi to being accepted by the international community as a normal, respected head of state.
Colonel, can we have a word, please? Are you pleased to have Tony Blair here?
As soon as he embarked on what's called the infitah, the opening and the détente with the West in 2003, the paying for the Lockerbie victims, we're beginning to see a process that he can't fully control. Satellite television comes into Libya. Then there are the economic reforms. Then the Western oil companies return. And this begins to initiate a situation where you have a hard line who are like, we shouldn't do this. We got to restrict all the visas to Westerners. This is going to lead to the overthrow of the regime. We've got to do it the old way. There is a process from 2005 onward where there's a struggle between reformers and hardliners.
His regime was turning on itself. Reformers sought to open doors, hardliners slammed them shut. And in the middle stood Gaddafi. No longer the unshakable ruler, but the center of a storm he couldn't fully contain.
First of all, as we saw in Tunisia and Egypt, the use of social media, people's ability to take pictures on their phone and spread them around the world in minutes, counteracted the enormous control of information that the regime had always had, and control of the media and images. So the regime lost that control. Suddenly everybody knew what was happening in real time. As a result of the opening up of the economy, people had started to create businesses and were getting wealthier, but of course there was a gap. In the 90s, when everybody was extremely poor because of sanctions and couldn't get anything, all the Libyans were in the same boat. By 2010, those well-connected in the regime who had access to resources and could get a cut in on businesses because corruption was rife, were building themselves huge villas at the end of the street. And so there was this visible corruption, visible inequality was feeding resentment. Wherever you went in the weeks leading up to the Arab Spring in Libya, in ministers, government offices, in shops, wherever you went, television was on in the background, Al Jazeera, showing what was happening. It created a very emotional climate.
We want all the power to the people.
In Libya, the Arab Spring uprisings were triggered later than in Tunisia and Egypt, and I think the world had assumed that Libya was such a repressive police state that they would be able to control any unhappiness. The actual final trigger was the calling of a day of rage in Libya to match what had happened in Tunisia and Egypt on the 17th of February.
Gaddafi says these people protesting against him have been drugged by Al-Qaeda and the US, and the drugs will soon wear off.
Gaddafi felt it's never going to happen here. The mistake that he did that led to his overthrow was when there were limited protests in Benghazi from civil society activists and lawyers, he fired into the crowd.
People were beaten up and arrested and shot in the street. There was a sense the government was losing control.
As soon as you fire into the crowd and people get killed with live bullets, what do you know? More people come and protest.
Very soon we were reporting that law and order was breaking down on the streets in Tripoli. We were really confined to one building. It wasn't safe to go outside. At night there was shooting all around, including bullets ricocheting off the walls. You kept away from the windows at all times. And it was fairly chaotic. We were sort of sleep, when we could grab a few hours sleep, we were doing it, on the floor in the corridor near our desks and managing as best we could. So it became very dangerous to move around, and we therefore decided to evacuate. It was a revolution of separate uprisings moving across the country.
The streets ran with fear. Voices were met with bullets, and then he appeared, not in a war room, but in the rain. It was the image of a ruler unraveling. As the days turned violent, foreign governments began emergency evacuations. The exodus had begun.
There were, of course, times then when you thought, you know, how could we get out? There were no more ships leaving the harbour. The road was closed to the coast because the rebels and other militia had set up checkpoints and were shooting people who tried to go through. The main airport had closed, and the secondary airport at Matiga was accessible but controlled by the Libyans and only normally used for military flights at that point. So there were times you went to bed thinking this may be it. A flight would try and get into Tripoli International Airport to pick us up, so we tried to make our way there at a time when we felt that most of the fighting on the roads roundabout would have died down because people were sleeping in the early morning between the nights fighting and the next day. Arrived at the airport without incident, left the cars, probably had to walk about the last kilometre because there were so many abandoned vehicles and so many individuals. The airport itself was under siege. Thousands and thousands of people from all over who had been working in Libya but had essentially seen their work and their homes disappear, had headed for the airport hoping that they would be evacuated home, but by then all evacuation flights had stopped. So there was a camp of tens of thousands of people outside the airport, between us and the airport perimeter and buildings. So that was a huge challenge, finding our way through that crowd. We knew we had an aircraft on the other side, but we only had a limited time to wait for us. But eventually we got on the flight and left for Malta.
From February 21 until March 6, you see the rebels gaining territory.
Libya was slipping through his fingers. The tide had turned, but he kept swimming against it.
Soon after we left, Gaddafi had gradually recovered his momentum, having been sort of taken aback for a couple of weeks. At that point, Gaddafi and his son made quite blood-curdling speeches threatening the inhabitants of Benghazi as traitors.
قد تندمون يوم لا ينفع الندم الذي بيته من الزجاج لا يرجم الناس بالحجارة. من أنتم؟ دقت ساعة العمل، دقت ساعة الزحف، دقت ساعة الانتصار. لا رجوع، إلى الأمام، إلى الأمام، إلى الأمام. ثورة، ثورة.
And that was the point where military action was initiated in order to stop the army moving in and any risk of massacre of civilians in Libya's second city.
In just 1 month, the United States has worked with our international partners to mobilize a broad coalition, secure an international mandate to protect civilians, stop an advancing army, prevent a massacre, and establish a no-fly zone with our allies and partners.
That completely caught him off guard because there was no movement in Egypt or Tunisia with the Arab Spring movements there for Western military support. He calculated 10% of the people will rebel. I've got more guns than they do. We have the tanks, they don't. We'll crush them. Well, then the goose was cooked. He wasn't going to be able to stand up to a series of uprisings supported by a Western no-fly zone.
It continued to support the rebels, acting really as a sort of rebel air force. There was always the red line drawn both by the Libyan rebels and by NATO that there wouldn't be troops put in on the ground to support the rebels. It would just be from the air only.
The red carpet in this hotel, at least, is still out for Colonel Gaddafi. He arrived surrounded by bodyguards who know the threat to him is greater than at any time in his 41 years in power.
That then continued month after month.
The rebels would have lost if there wasn't for this Western no-fly zone.
there was a sort of stalemate. The rebels weren't strong enough to overthrow Gaddafi, and he wasn't strong enough, thanks to NATO supporting them, to check them.
Gaddafi and his son out Libya. The second, we need the free, we need the democracy, all that.
He seemed to believe until the end that magically he would win. And he could have gotten out of the country. He could have gotten out of the country to Venezuela, probably to Russia, maybe to certain African countries who would have harbored him. But he thought he would win. So he fought and he held out in Tripoli. And when Tripoli fell, he fled to Sirte, his hometown. And it seems like he thought that he could even hold out in Sirte.
At some point there, he must have decided that the game was up and to make a sort of suicidal dash. By that time, Sirte had been surrounded by militias from the town of Misrata, just down the road, which is very solidly anti-Gaddafi and rebel. And they were moving into the city, and he would have been found. So he tried to make a run for it, but it must have been a run that he knew going in a convoy would just attract attention, that he wouldn't get out. He holed out in a villa at first at the side of the road, but when the fire and shelling of that villa was so intense, he and some others fled to a construction site next door, and he was found there in the drainage pipe. Clearly he had been wounded in the airstrike or an attack on the villa, because he had grenade wounds to the head even before he was captured.
There are two versions. One is that he was killed by the other side, and the other is that it was just a mob and somebody stuck a bayonet up his backside, and very painful death.
They killed him on the spot, and they took him off to a meat locker, and it was a very grotesque display. And it shows you a society so brutalized by Gaddafian oppression that it would have thought it okay, essentially, to hold as a trophy the brutalized body of its former dictator. There's something very perverse, very animalistic, almost Roman Empire-like. You know, if there was a slave rebellion against the Roman emperor, you might imagine seeing the Roman emperor's head on a pike. So the modern Libyan equivalent was to see a carcass in a meat locker that, as a dragon killer, almost couldn't be believed. It needed to be shown physically in a very disgusting manner.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Prime Minister Jibril has confirmed that Colonel Gaddafi is dead. I think today is a day to remember all of Colonel Gaddafi's victims, from those who died in connection with the Pan Am flight over Lockerbie, to Yvonne Fletcher in a London street, we should also remember the many, many Libyans who died at the hands of this brutal dictator and his regime.
Everybody showed enormous relief that it seemed that the struggle was over and that things could move on, there could be a new beginning.